Hi everybody, welcome to this online lesson. Today we are going to be looking at the Czech Uprising in the Cold War course, also known as the Prague Spring of 1968. There's a picture of Prague and a spring. This is one of my favourite topics in the Cold War course. I find it really fascinating just how it all unfolded. It is also really similar to the Hungarian uprising. So as we said previously in that lesson, if you get your head around one, then you generally got your head around the other as well. A few little tweaks in this one that are slightly different, but overall, the reasons for the uprising are very similar to Hungary. People fed up, they can't move, no freedom, all that kind of stuff. And the Soviet response is quite harsh as well. Okay, so really good topic, but this is a topic that definitely lends itself to a narrative, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And also, more likely, question 3, how important was the Prague Spring for international relations or development of the Cold War? Really cool topic. Let's get straight into it then. And remember, as always, with these kind of things, because they can be a little bit complicated and they all link together and sort of interlope, it's important that you do understand it. And if you don't, please ask your teacher as soon as possible. All right, so Brezhnev is the new leader. He takes over in 1964 after Khrushchev. Obviously, in the 60s, we've had the fallout from the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Berlin crisis is going on, the refugee crisis, the wall. Kennedy's just been assassinated. So there's all sorts of stuff going on here. There's a definite lead or move towards a bit more cooperation following the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this, again, is one of those things that is an internal challenge to the satellite states, to the Warsaw Pact, one that America may well just sit out. In the 1960s, of course, they're dealing with Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Vietnam War. So perhaps what goes on in Czechoslovakia is the least of America's worries. But in context, that doesn't mean the Soviets are allowed to necessarily do whatever they want, because it could be a threat to capitalism. So all that backstory in mind and context, let's get on with it. So to try and help you understand this is just a bit of an overview of the narrative of the thing, what we're going to do today. The people are fed up with the Soviet control of Czechoslovakia, no surprise there. They have a new leader called Dubcek who introduces some reforms. That's going to be the Prague Spring. This leads to Brezhnev warning Dubcek not to go too far with his reforms. If you remember previously in Hungary, when Khrushchev put Nagy in charge, Nagy went a bit too far with his reforms, especially the reform in where he was going to leave the Warsaw Pact. In this case, Dubcek is fully committed to the Warsaw Pact. There's no intention of leaving, but his reforms perhaps do go a little bit too far. Dubcek doesn't listen. He introduces his reforms. Brezhnev sends in the tanks to Czechoslovakia. So a sort of similar overview of the story. This sort of page here is just giving you a little bit of what's coming in today's lesson. Brezhnev, of course, as always, cannot allow these reforms because he thinks it will have a domino effect and a chain reaction into all other Warsaw Pact countries too. So ultimately what this comes down to is control again. All right, and then finally, Brezhnev responds to the Czech crisis by issuing what becomes known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. By now, we should know very well what a doctrine is. It's a sort of statement or political ideology or beliefs of a leader that will eventually lead on to policies. Okay, so that is the gist of what we're going to do today. I think we should have a little bit of a sort of consideration of where Czechoslovakia fits in so far. As we remember back at the very, very beginning of this story, the Cold War course, Stalin supported a coup in 1948, which removed non-communists from power. That's how they join the Warsaw Pact. They then establish a pro-Soviet communist government and have been communist ever since. Which, as you look on the map there, Czechoslovakia secures the buffer zone. That is the plug, if you like, into the gap of the buffer zone, the satellite states, to protect the Soviet Union from Western expansion at the beginning of this story. So Czechoslovakia is crucial in keeping that hole into the Soviet Union plugged from the West. Okay, so with that said, how you want to set up today's lesson in your notes, I would do something like this. If you're watching this because you missed the lesson, this is how we did it in class. And again, if you're watching it for revision, then this is the best way to do most of the Cold War topics, especially where there is an obvious beginning, middle, and end. Do your notes as we did with Hungary, reasons for the uprisings, the causes, then part 2, what happens, the reforms in the middle, and then the Soviet response at the end. That should prepare you for a narrative. At the end of this lesson, there'll be an opportunity for you to write a narrative, and there will also be a model narrative for you to try and get your head around and give it some marks. Okay, so causes, part 1 then of your notes of the Prague Spring, always economy, always lack of freedom. And again, foolishly, perhaps you might say, the people of Czechoslovakia thought that America would help. America is going on and on all the time about supporting communist, anti-communist groups or countries, and they thought that America would help. They didn't help in Hungary in 1956, so I'm not sure why they believed in 1968 they would. But hey-ho, the decade of the 60s is very different to the decade of the 50s. As we've talked about at the start of this lesson, there's a really big difference in context. Cuba has happened. There's a definite, I suppose, leaning towards more cooperation. Tensions have gone down a little bit in the 60s. Both countries are struggling economically, and with other things going on at home. So maybe, just maybe, the people of Czechoslovakia thought this was the chance they had when everyone was a bit more willing to perhaps work together. So thinking back to Hungary, try and make a list, pause the video and make a list of all the problems they had. And if you can't remember them, just put one or two. But generally speaking, A, B, and C over there give you a bit of an idea. And then let's remind ourselves. So there are riots, as there was in Hungary. And this is caused similarly in Hungary by the rule of Soviets being too strict. The secret police spying on them, limiting personal freedoms, all of those things from Moscow. The economy was being run essentially for the Soviet Union. So all the agriculture, all the, I suppose, profits and monies of the country were going out of the country. The workers were seeing a little bit less of that than they had hoped for. There are few consumer goods, which is generally the story in a communist country, isn't it? But people are fed up of that. There's no freedom of speech. Radio, TV, and newspapers are censored and controlled by Moscow. And the government ministers are being purged on a very frequent basis. So the people of Czechoslovakia are just fed up. They are fed up of the low standard of living as well. That is generally another sort of bit of communism, I guess. The standard of living is weak, is low. Everyone's got just enough, but no one's got more than enough. And then this led to riots and protests. So this would be essentially your paragraph 1. A little bit of these, maybe 3 or 4 of these examples as to why the people of Czechoslovakia were unhappy and began their riots. So very, very, very similar to Hungary. Hopefully you can see that. All right, so with your notes and that bit there done, hopefully you're ready for moving on to the middle bit of our story, okay? So Dubcek comes along, the leader of Czechoslovakia, and he's got this sort of slogan, socialism with a human face, trying to make communism look good. He says you can crush the flowers, but you can't stop the spring. That's a reference to spring. Every year, things start to come back alive again and grow. The quote there, maybe have a little think about what your impression of Dubcek is. He seems to me, for me, to be quite a positive guy. He's looking at change. He's always looking at the positive of things, socialism with a human face, because communism so far, and I suppose there is a bit of a distinction to make here with communism and socialism. Communism is the extreme, isn't it, left? So he's sort of trying to say here, we can see the bad side of communism within the Warsaw Pact, low standard of living, all of these things. We think we can have that, socialism he calls it, which is probably a little bit less extreme than communism, but make it human, make it nice, make it livable, make people want to be in a socialist country. That's his plan. So he comes along in 1968. He replaces Novotny, who was pro-Soviet Union and supported the Soviet Union. So obviously the people have spoken in this election. And he is restored, as was Nagy, with restoring order in Czechoslovakia. His little thing about socialism with a human face comes to this quote. Dubcek says, the most important thing to me is communism is the right way forward. So this guy is a communist. He is a supporter of communism. He does not want to leave the Warsaw Pact. He does, however, believe it should not make people miserable. They should be able to enjoy life, express their views and challenge the government without fear of being punished by the government. We need to offer socialism with a human face. So that is overall what Dubcek is going to try and do. There's nothing wrong with that on its own. But again, Russia, Moscow will be worried about this kind of thing, I suppose, dominoing across the satellite states. Now, Khrushchev said something similar when he took power in the 1950s, remember, the idea about why would anyone want to be in communism if their life was awful. So that is kind of what Dubcek's going to do, and that forms the basis of his Prague Spring, his reforms. All right, so the Soviet Union's response to that, what do you reckon? Are they going to tell him not to, tell him off, tell him to be careful with his words? Are they going to get a response militarily? up to you. Now, I think at this point it's quite clear that maybe just a little warning. Just be careful what you're saying, because you've just been elected and we don't want to have chaos after an election and all the rest of it. You know, the optics of that aren't good, even for the satellite states and for Moscow. It may look like they're starting to lose a bit of control here. Remember, the new leader, Brezhnev, has been in power for a good couple of years now, 4 years or so. So he is probably well established, but also this would be a challenge to his routine. But it is important to remember they are committed to the Warsaw Pact, unlike what Naj said, and they are committed to communism. So there's a slightly different context here for Dubcek. He seems to be saying all the right things, but he is a full-blown communist. Okay, so these are now the reforms. They become known as the Prague Spring. So like Naj's reforms, these are Dubcek's. You'll need to know a couple of these. Obviously, the more you know, the easier it'll be to pad out a paragraph. But essentially, the first one is he's going to relax the censorship from the government, and he's going to allow criticism of the government. So that's the first reform. Again, that's great for the people of Czechoslovakia, probably why he got elected, I guess. He's also going to give the trade unions back some powers. So trade unions, remember, are banned generally from dictators. They are the voice of the people, especially in work. And he's going to reduce the control, if you like, of industry by the government. So industry is going to be able to start looking after itself a little bit. Trade unions are going to be trying to get better working conditions for the workers. This all sounds great. Remember, socialism with a human face. More power is going to be given to local government rather than being centralized from probably Prague, but also mainly from Moscow, of course. So more local power is going to be given. Trade with the West is going to be increased. Now, this is a big alarm bell here, isn't it? That the Czechoslovakia is going to start trading with the West. We're essentially going to be allowing capitalism then into Czechoslovakia, which obviously the Warsaw Pact, the satellite states, they're all communist. That just can't be allowed, especially if it leads to Czechoslovakia improving the outcomes. The other countries in the satellite states will very quickly want a bit of that as well. Okay? Czech people are given greater freedoms to travel, especially abroad, and travel to the West, where they can go. And the problem is there, they might be influenced, they might see life is so much better, and all of those things then start feeding back to the Soviet Union's control and the control of communism in general. So that is a worry for Moscow as well. And the last reform that Dubcek brings in, which is possibly one of the most dangerous in terms of Soviet control of the satellite states, is that he is going to allow multi-party elections, all right, in the future. So something that's going to come later on, essentially democracy. So overall, with those Prague Springs, make sure you've written those down and you've understood what Dubcek is trying to do. None of that seems extreme or horrendous. It's very similar to most democracies. The problem here is that the Soviet Union are in control, and this is going to be a challenge to them. So hopefully Dubcek's quite happy with those reforms, puts them through, and as we saw at the start of this lesson, there are some warnings for Dubcek, definitely. So overall, the Czech people, these reforms encourage opponents of communism, multi-party. That means you get non-communist parties, so they're loving life. But Moscow is angry. Czechoslovakia is central, as we've seen in the map, to the Eastern Bloc, and is the strongest industry of all. If Czechoslovakia leaves the Warsaw Pact, it's going to split the Eastern Bloc, the satellite states, and would allow NATO and Western countries the chance to influence the East, especially regarding trade with the West. So altogether, there's no way Moscow are going to allow these reforms. Okay? So the USSR response, as always, there's a response. This will be the end of our story, so part 3 of your notes. Brezhnev is the leader of the Soviet Union, does not care that Dubcek will remain in the Warsaw Pact. He's not bothered about that. It doesn't matter that he's loyal. If he allows these reforms, he's worried that everyone else in the Warsaw Pact will want similar reforms. The Soviet Union are already struggling with Romania. They're not going to Warsaw Pact meetings. And of course, Tito of Yugoslavia is not accepting control from Moscow. So just no. This is where Brezhnev is on this. He can't allow it because he's worried about losing control. He's also worried that the satellite states seem to be crumbling a little bit. They're sort of falling apart from within. So this is his opportunity to be strong, like Khrushchev was when he first came to power and used Hungary as a sort of stepping stone to taking power. This is going to be Brezhnev's opportunity to do that as well. So just summarize before we move on in your book or your Google Doc, however you're doing this. What is Brezhnev's issue with Dubcek's reforms? Not necessarily with Dubcek, but with the reforms. When you've done that, unpause the video and we'll carry on. It's essentially just a sentence here. Okay, so Brezhnev urged Dubcek not to undermine communism in Czechoslovakia. That's the warning, the sort of polite warning, if you like. He's ordered members of the Warsaw Pact to threaten Dubcek by putting troops near Czechoslovakia, near the border. So this is just a sort of step before an invasion. It's just putting pressure on Dubcek to back down a little bit. Dubcek invites the leader of Romania and Tito, who's the leader of Yugoslavia, to Prague. Now remember, Brezhnev has got problems with Yugoslavia and Romania. There's a bit of a protest going on, a little bit of sort of anti-Moscow. So that to Brezhnev looks like a threat. It looks like those three are essentially going to gang up, perhaps work together, perhaps leave the Warsaw Pact, join NATO. Who knows what Brezhnev is thinking there, but he sees it as a threat generally. So how does Brezhnev feel at this point? And this is going to be the reaction to how he responds in the Prague Spring. Okay, so this is quite serious right now for Brezhnev. What he does next might change the sort of direction of the Cold War. It might affect international relations, and it certainly will affect relations within the Warsaw Pact. That's already starting to crumble a little bit. Right, so next, this masterpiece that I created, Photoshopping skills are not the best, is you can hopefully work out from this image that the bull, Moscow, Russia, comes charging in, smashes out the matador, which is Dubcek and Czechoslovakia, and that'll be the end of that. That's the image that I was trying to portray in this picture. Keep your judgments to yourself, please. I actually think this is the greatest thing I've ever made. All right, so the response, more importantly for your notes, is they send in 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops, an invasion of Czechoslovakia, just like Ukraine today and previously just like Hungary. This ends the Prague Spring. Dubcek was warned and Dubcek didn't stop. And you can see from this little map where they're generally coming from: East Germany, Poland and Hungary, and of course the Soviet Union, all piling into Prague to end it. 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops. That's a huge amount, okay, of people. Now, most of these Warsaw Pact troops were lied to. They believed they were being invited in by Czechoslovakia to help with the problems and the tensions. But in fact, that wasn't the case at all. There was little to no opposition to the invasion. I mean, why would you when 500,000 tanks have arrived, or troops at least? Some tried to take control of the tanks, but generally there was no opposition. Some people put flowers in the hairs of the soldiers, Some people tried to talk to the soldiers and ask them why they're doing this. Generally speaking, but the opposition was limited. There was a little guy called Jan Palach, a student who set himself on fire in protest. We'll have a little talk about him in a sec, but there was some pockets of opposition, but generally speaking, the Warsaw Pact troops were met with very, very little opposition. Brezhnev has ordered the Czech army to stay in their barracks and not fight back. That's an order from Moscow, and of course that would lead to some serious consequence if the Czech army did in fact ignore that. We're talking possibly a nuclear response, aren't we? All right. And then Brezhnev tells the Warsaw Pact members that they've been invited. Of course, we've just talked about that. That's not true. And the hostility they were met with did surprise them, did shock them. Hostility and opposition are two different things. There was people there saying, get out of our country, just like in Ukraine. But they were also met with this weird kind of protest we've talked about, people putting flowers in their hair and stuff like that. So that's Brezhnev's response, part 3, I guess, of the narrative story. And this source is really quite interesting, just to give you an eyes on the ground kind of look at this. This is a young journalist who's describing what happened when they arrived. I remember very well the face of the first Soviet soldier I saw. He was carrying a huge machine gun and looked like he'd just stepped out of a film about the Battle of Stalingrad. He was very dirty and his face was full of sweat. It was absolutely ridiculous, absolutely absurd. I tried to talk to him, but it was pointless. He wouldn't speak to me. Even later on, when I did manage to speak to some of the soldiers, it was useless. They were totally indoctrinated. They believed they had prevented the outbreak of World War III or something. So this is a response from a journalist trying to talk to these troops who arrived and basically saying he's getting nothing out of them. They are brainwashed. They are indoctrinated. They are here. They've been told by Moscow they're here to be heroes and saviors to the hell and chaos that's happening in Czechoslovakia. All right, so quick quiz. Pause the video, answer these questions. You will be able to see the answers in a minute, but just make sure you've tried to answer as many as you can before we look at the answers. And then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll put the answers on the screen. Right, hopefully you got a few of these here. You need 3 of them. Answer to number 2 is Dubcek, socialism with a human face. Communism, communist and a keen fan of the Warsaw Pact. That's why he was essentially elected or got the job. The Prague Spring, any three of those. Brezhnev, and his response was 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops occupied Czechoslovakia, and then his doctrine, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then bonus question, 1968 into 69. So the doctrine bit, you won't have been able to answer that, but we'll do that in a minute. That is the response. And if you are year 11 and you've done that, hopefully you got all of those right, or certainly most of them. Okay. This Jan Palach story, if you just YouTube Burning Bush, is a good clip that sort of is a very quick, short clip that gives you the insight of what kind of happened in this little story. A student who set himself on fire becomes a symbol for the Soviet opposition across Europe. He killed himself, but he sort of becomes this kind of martyr, if you like, of the thing. So watch that, have a little think about what the people of Czechoslovakia were sort of doing, the leaders of Czechoslovakia and the Soviet attitude to Czechoslovakia. This was not a good look for the Soviet Union, and as we've said, it sort of creates a bit of a martyr, really, a bit of a symbol for opposition and inspiration for possibly other inspiration around the Warsaw Pact. So now let's pause a little bit. Let's get our head around everything we've talked about in this lesson. The Soviets have taken control or retaken control of Czechoslovakia, and they have retaken control of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, sorry. There is now no doubt, again, just like after Hungary, who is in charge? It is Brezhnev, it is Moscow. So Dubcek is removed. He's ordered to reverse his reforms. He's then arrested and replaced by Husak, who is a hardline loyalist, hardliner to Moscow, full support of Moscow. He's going to do basically whatever Moscow says. He clamps down on Czechoslovakia, arrests about 1,000 Czech people. A really sort of aggressive response, nowhere near the 20,000 dead people in Hungary, but still a kind of aggressive response. Czechoslovakia is once again now firmly in control by the Soviet Union. All right. So let's take a bit of moment there now to think about this Brezhnev doctrine, about as scary as this picture of Brezhnev is. So remember, Truman's doctrine was that he will do whatever it takes to stop the spread of communism. That might be militarily support or economic support. So a doctrine is basically a belief, all right, an ideology of the leader, which informs their policies. The Brezhnev doctrine is going to be aggressive, very similar to the Truman doctrine, but it kind of focuses more on the satellite states, really. So he says, my actions may have appeared an aggressive attempt to dominate another European country, but I prefer to look at it as necessary to protect communism. So he's sort of justifying his response in Czechoslovakia there. So the first part of the Brezhnev doctrine, if one satellite state's actions threaten the Eastern Bloc, so the other countries in the Warsaw Pact, in the satellite states, is the duty of the rest of the Warsaw Pact to step in and stop them, which is why we entered Czechoslovakia. This will stop them copying what happened in Czechoslovakia. So that's a similar thing to NATO, isn't it? If one NATO country is interfered with, then all NATO countries are duty-bound to get involved and support. That's all he's saying here. No real difference to the politics of the world. It's within the satellite states. It's an internal sort of affair. But what he's doing is he's making it absolutely clear that all Warsaw Pact countries have a duty to interfere or intervene in each other's countries if any of them step out of line, like Czechoslovakia have just done. He also says if any communist country is threatened by a capitalist one, then all communist states have the right to intervene using force. This is where we get a little bit more threatening. This is where we start raising some tensions around the world a little bit with number 2 of the Brezhnev doctrine. It's no different to the US approach, to the Truman doctrine. It's a threat. It's a warning that the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries will get involved using force if anyone interferes with these communist states, which may be a good thing, maybe a bad thing. That the 60s is a period where we're starting to get towards a bit more of a peaceful relationship, or certainly a cooperation, as we enter the 70s with détente. But the Brezhnev doctrine is number 1 primarily, and with a little bit of a caveat, while I'm here, I'm warning the rest of the world, if you get involved in our affairs, then they will all have to get involved too. That really is just what the Warsaw Pact was anyway, just the equivalent to NATO. Anyway, Brezhnev has come out quite aggressively. He's issued this doctrine publicly. That's the problem. So the similarities to the Truman doctrine are basically they will stop communist countries from introducing reforms that will undermine communism, and they're prepared to use force against capitalism. Hopefully you understand that. And the message of the Brezhnev Doctrine is that he is in charge, absolutely in charge. No Soviet satellite state should ever be in any doubt ever again. Now, question 3 of our exam. For the rest of this lesson, we're going to have a little look at some exam technique for some of the questions, 1, 2, and 3. This would be more so for question 3. But you could think about this as a consequence. So question 1, one consequence of the Prague Spring. Any of these would be one consequence. You only need 4 marks, remember. But more likely going to be question 3. How important was the Prague Spring for international relations in this case? So look at the countries in the little boxes, make a note in your own Google Doc, and if you're watching this because you missed the lesson, this will be in your Google Classroom. If you're watching this just otherwise, make a note of these countries, read the green box, and just try to summarize in each of these boxes what the Prague Spring did for relations between each of these countries. There's a little mention there. It's quite brief, so your summary is quite brief as well, but you're going to see that this had an impact on a lot of countries. Yugoslavia and Romania, obviously, they were already struggling with the communist bits. They condemned it, so their relations aren't any better, but they're in it, so I guess they're now controlled a bit more. Read through them and fill in your boxes what's going on and how this has impacted on international relations. It's more likely going to be your question 3. I mean, it could be international relations between the superpowers, or it could be how did the Czech uprising develop the Cold War. It's more likely going to be international relations. That's why it's important to take this moment now just to get your head around the impact of this on relations of all of these different countries, because it did affect them all. Once again, the USA was busy, didn't get involved despite arguably promising to help. Weaken them further. The Soviet Union laugh again. The Eastern countries again, they maybe had this thought or hope that America have changed their tune since 1956, but they didn't. They're busy with Vietnam and other bits, so they were criticized as well for being weak. Again, we've come out of this Cuban Missile Crisis. That might explain a little bit why all sides are a little bit reluctant to go full guns a-blazing on this one. So interesting. If this happened before the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe the response would have been a whole lot different. Who knows? But this is your opportunity. Just pause the video, get your head around the impact on each country of Czechoslovakia, and then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll carry on. All right, so the Prague Spring is a little thing. We did this with the Hungary lesson, so just get some colours, read through these bits, either do a little table where you can just put causes, events, and Soviet response, and just read through it and put some bullet points of what's happened in each one. Then we'll get our head around the big picture, and you should be able to hopefully do something similar, or when you're revising, put the Hungary and Prague ones together and you'll see some of those really common features of both stories. Soviet response is always the same. Western response, in this case, none, apart from a condemnation, again, words, and then the middle bit, the events. Okay, when you've done that, unpause and carry on, and we'll have a little look at the narrative question. So just to prepare for that narrative then, let's have a little look at the key events. Beginning, we've got the riots due to the anger at Soviet control. We've got the middle, the Prague Spring, the reforms, and the end, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. That's the gist of where we are. This might say in a question, the bullet points might say, write a narrative account about the events in Czechoslovakia. It might give you one bullet point that says riots. Bullet point 2 might say the reforms. That means that your third bullet point or your third paragraph is going to be the end. Remember, for the narrative question, they might give you 2 bullet points, one beginning, one end. You'd need to do the middle. And if they give you middle and end, then you need to do your third paragraph needs to be the beginning. Just make sure that you have your head around the chronology of the thing. Take a little bit of time, 30 seconds or so, to just scribble on your exam paper what the chronology of events is, looking at the 2 bullet points they give you, try and work out where your third one fits. All right, so following the plan of this, I want you to have a go at writing a narrative. You're going to see a model one in a sec, but just have a go at writing this narrative now. It's 8 marks. It should take you up to maybe 12 minutes or so. And if you are watching this as you're approaching your exams in year 11, the narrative question should be fairly straightforward. It might even be in your booklets if you haven't done this one yet. Have a go. Aim for between 12 to 15 minutes for now. And obviously, as we're getting towards your exam, we probably want to make that just a little bit quicker. But that's roughly where we are. When you've written yours, you'll see the model answer about to appear on the screen. So just mark it, all right? But try, please, just have a go yourself before you look at mine. or otherwise, just look at mine straight away and then mark it, give it some feedback, see if you think it's full marks or see where you think it's lacking some work. So this is the one on the screen here. This is mine. Highlight any of the connectives. If there's not enough connectives, add them. Are there some of those process words, worsening, improving, intensifying? Are there enough of those? Are we relating back to the question all the way through this thing? And then give it a score and some feedback. Ideally, you'll be able to have written your own narrative and then compare it to this one. Or once you've read this one and you feel like you fixed it up a little bit or you can improve it, now then maybe write your own. Of course, as always, anything that you do write in terms of exam questions or your notes, get it checked by your teacher just to see if you're on the right path. This as a narrative is a perfect story or topic to get your head around, just like Hungary is as well. Really nice way for you to say this made things worse, this intensified relations, or whatever you might want to say there. All right, then we'll get that checked and bring an end to this lesson. With these little questions, you can do the same as always. These are from our textbook we use in class. Make sure you understand those quick questions there. They're probably the core bits of the story. And as always, thank you very much for watching this lesson. Hopefully it was helpful. If not, ask your teachers. Definitely important that you do ask your teachers before you move on. We will see you for the next video. Thank you very much and goodbye.